In an article titled Exodus of Clergy, the Role of Leadership in Responding to the Call, it begins by stating that a lack of good leadership is one of the contributing factors to the shortage of clergy. There are many churches in many places that suffer from this dilemma, and unfortunately some of the leaders are kicked out if they're bad leaders, and some leave simply because there are bad leaders. I've seen both scenarios in churches that I've attended. Now, these bad leaders aren't necessarily bad because of conflict or sin, but rather it's an issue of communication within their ministry and leadership role. The influence of communication and leadership is important to pastoring and leading a ministry. With this in consideration, pastors, lay people, and anyone else who are considering a lead role in ministry may be able to lead properly and confidently. Leadership requires understanding, a right attitude or behavior, and interpersonal communication and relationships. But these things must be at the forefront of their thoughts and practiced if they wish to be successful leaders within their ministries. First, being a leader requires understanding. Now, ministry isn't just about preaching and teaching. In fact, there's more counseling and guiding than teaching and preaching. This requires understanding in using the situational approach. The leader must first listen to understand. Today, there are many people who listen to respond than to listen to understand. This is one of the contributing factors to bad leadership. There's no discerning when a person listens to respond, so how can anyone lead and serve effectively if there isn't a working together, which is what the situational approach boils down to? Both persons must be open to each other to understand and communicate properly, but the situational part of this approach depends on the situation. One approach that works for one situation may not work for another. It's a flexible communication, and leaders must learn and know how to approach any situation if they wish to be successful in leading. So leadership requires understanding. Second, leadership requires a right attitude or behavior. This goes hand in hand with understanding. If a leader has a poor attitude about a situation or person, then that person cannot lead or communicate effectively, resulting in people leaving a church or ministry. One example that I've witnessed is a holier-than-thou attitude or prejudice. Certain people have to look like a certain type of person for a leader to interact with that person. And there are many other examples, but the important thing is to have a healthy attitude and godly behavior. In an article titled The 7 Scales to Measure the 7 Beatitudes in Leaders, it relates Matthew 5 to being a good leader. It says that Jesus' followers must demonstrate humility and willingness to learn. They must have compassion for others. They must exhibit discipline, wisdom, and compassion. They must be highly focused, and they must be peacemakers. These principles not only give insight to being a good leader, but they also relate to the understanding aspect of leadership. Lastly, being a leader requires interpersonal communication and leaderships. This seems pretty simple and logical because communication requires at least interpersonal communication or dyadic communication. But to build relationships, to have good communication, and to be a good leader, leaders must know how to use interpersonal communication if leading is to be successful. In explaining Christian leadership, an article titled A Triad of Pastoral Leadership, it explains that leadership is the God-given ability to influence others so that believers will trust and respond. That is, with understanding a right attitude in interpersonal communication and relationships, leaders can gain trust and build relationships and influence others. The most vital component of leadership in ministry, though, is an interpersonal communication and relationship with God. How can a leader expect to communicate, build relationships, and lead a ministry if they themselves do not communicate and have a relationship with God. So why is there a shortage of clergy in the church? Why is the lack of good leadership a contributing factor in the shortage of clergy? In the article mentioned earlier, Exodus of Clergy, several interviews were conducted in which people stated that leaderships showed favoritism. There was a lack of communication, listening, unethical behavior. So the influence of communication and leadership is important to pastoring and leading a ministry. Leading demands understanding, a right attitude or behavior, and interpersonal communication in relationships. American pastor and author John Maxwell stated that a leader who produces other leaders multiplies their influences. Isn't that one of the main goals for the kingdom of God? To produce leaders to go out into the world?